Guys, I love trains so much, and if you have the misfortune of knowing me in real life, you know that I kind of don't shut up about them. Literally, trains are the ideal form of transportation. If I could reasonably take a train everywhere, I would. Anyway, so a couple weeks ago, I did something that I've always wanted to do. I took Amtrak across the country. I wanted to go visit my family in LA, and well, due to reasons, I don't exactly want to get on a plane right now. So what better time to fulfill my dreams and take the Southwest Chief from Chicago to Los Angeles. I've always been fascinated with historical train travel and the alluring glamour of its golden era. Oddly enough, the US used to have the most extensive train system in the world, and today almost all of it is gone. Look at this map and tell me it doesn't make you depressed. Well, later on in this video, I'll get into how my experience on the Southwest Chief went, both directions, but before that, I think we need to ride back in time a little bit and see what train travel was like in its earliest years during the Victorian era. As much as people complain about train travel inconveniences today, they are nothing compared to what people had to put up with 150 years ago. Between flying cinders, no bathrooms, train madness, and potential robbery and murder, what else could go wrong? Well, it turns out so many things. Come learn with me. But first, a word from today's sponsor, the book. Recently, I've had encyclopedias on the mind, partly because I've been thinking of ways that communities can help each other through the sharing of practical knowledge, which is why I was so excited when Hungry Minds released the book, The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding a Civilization. And let me tell you, this thing really is the book. I mean, this thing is enormous and chock full of 400 pages on high-quality art map paper, showcasing stunning full-color illustrations on 180 different topics on a huge array of things that humans have invented, developed, and imagined over the course of our existence. First of all, look at this beautiful illuminated cover. I've had so much fun flipping through the book, gazing upon these intricately crafted drawings, which all really harken back to medieval and Baroque technological illustrations, which I love, and I'm not even close to finishing it. Not only is this a really handy reference for so many topics that I'm curious about, or anyone would be curious about, it's a practical guide for really vital things too, like developing penicillin, locating water, building a shelter, dealing with angry crowds, as well as history facts that we would all do well to remember. It looks so beautiful on my shelf. I'm so pleased to look at it every single day, and I made sure to put my stamp inside of it because I know I'm keeping this thing forever. Following its extremely successful top Kickstarter campaign with the contributing knowledge and talents of over 50 artists, scientists, and designers, the book is a fascinating best-selling journey through human history for both adults and children alike, and would make an amazing gift or addition to the library of anyone who, like you, has a hungry mind. Head to the link in the description below or scan this QR code to get your copy of the book and use my code Kaz at checkout to get a free gift. Thank you to the book for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back to learning about Victorian train travel. Industrialization, of course, is the defining factor in the Victorian psyche. Within only 1 or 2 generations, many countries in the 19th century rapidly transitioned from a world driven by nature into one ruled by mechanical life, a sudden explosion in moving metal mechanisms, coal-powered industry, rapid expansion of automata. A world previously wholly intertwined in the power of nature was now instead dominated by the controlling hand of human innovation and the cold, ashen world of oily metal machines. Something that I personally had never really thought about before as a major factor in industrialization was the loss of previous resources, meaning the massive deforestation of Europe, specifically the Western region, leading to a huge lack of wood resources and the growing need for an alternative. Metals, a material previously always present but never nearly as ubiquitous as wood was. Werner Sombart wrote in his 1902 book Der moderne Kapitalismus, wood affected all areas of cultural existence, being the prerequisite for the prosperity of all branches of economic life. So general was its use in the production of material goods that the characteristics of culture before the 18th century were decidedly wooden. and thus that culture retained an organic quality in its material and sensual aspect. This really struck me when I read it because it just makes complete sense. But as a post-industrial society, we have no way of fully comprehending this dramatic shift that the Victorians experienced. The closest we can get is the shift between the pre- and post-internet world, which is arguably just as dramatic, but basically no one alive today has any memory of a world without digital technology of some kind. A world where every space we occupy contains devices, furniture, and buildings that are in some way mechanical or made of man-made materials. Of course, many people alive today were around for the advent of the internet. The fear and confusion and rapid changing of every aspect of human life that happened then is not all that different from what the Victorians experienced watching their lives industrialize, and nothing better encapsulates this feeling than the advent of the steam engine. One of the earliest steam engines came around as early as the 1710s, developed by Thomas Newcomen, improved on over the next several decades by James Watt, and then in 1801 came Oliver Evans' high-pressure steam engine. Mix this with the already existing technology of railways, which had been used to move coal from mines since at least the medieval era, there was suddenly a new ripe opportunity to completely revolutionize travel. The 1820s saw the beginning of the railroad movement, which advocated for the expansion of steam-powered transportation of coal, goods, and people. They argued, well, horses eat a lot of food, and we have so many horses for transportation. Wouldn't it be better to trade off feeding 1 million horses to feed 8 million human workers instead? Although, at the same time, environmental concerns were already cropping up. Some writers argued that while trains are more economical and save money, they have to consume coal, a non-renewable resource, whereas horses consume food from the earth, which is obviously renewable. But the movement could not be stopped, and by the middle of the century, trains were fully realized. Many writers celebrated the slow death of travel by horse-drawn coach, which was unpredictable, slow, and really rough. Still others, though, mourned the poetic loss of something so long ingrained in their lives. One anonymous contributor wrote in The Roads and Railroads, Vehicles, and Modes of Traveling of Ancient and Modern Countries in 1839, "When we are traveling by stagecoach at the rate of 8 or 10 miles an hour, we can understand the nature of the force which sets the vehicle in motion. But when proceeding on a journey by the railroad, we are seldom allowed to get a sight of the wondrous power which draws us so rapidly along. The scene is altogether changed, and there are no animals yoked to the car to excite our pity by their apparently short but really severe labor. We hear the steam gushing from the safety valve while the machine is, for a short time, stationary. Then we hear a number of rapid beatings. We feel that we are moving, the motion soon increases rapidly, and the journey which by stagecoach is so tedious is here, long before we are aware of it, at an end. The traveler then wonders not only at the rapidity of his journey, but often wishes to inspect and comprehend the means by which it was effected." I can sympathize with this because I, like many others, feel this same way today comparing train travel to something like plane travel. I've never really enjoyed planes. I don't get any excitement at the marvel of being in the sky. I'm just terrified. I hate sitting in the cramped tin can in the air, surrounded on all sides by 100 other miserable passengers, many of whom have clearly never been in public before, if the way they're acting is any indication, who are usually coughing and sneezing unmasked and, increasingly in recent years, watching TikTok on their phones with no headphones. Every time the plane experiences turbulence, my brain instantly knows that logically it's not going to fall out of the sky, but I really feel like it might be my final hour. It's absolutely exhausting from the minute you enter the airport till when you reach your destination. You have so little control, and the thing is, the process of plane travel is kind of an ephemeral experience that the human mind really struggles to comprehend. At least most of us who aren't like plane guys. Within only a few hours, you are suddenly thousands of miles away in a completely new place without having seen basically any of the journey nor fully understanding how you got there. This is how the Victorians felt about train travel for years. Where before, the average rate of travel was 8 to 10 miles per hour, give or take, by coach, The typical train could go 20 to 30 miles per hour, about 3 times faster than before, and increasingly faster over time. A Quarterly Review article, volume 63 in 1839, called this "the gradual annihilation, approaching almost to the final extinction, of that space and of those distances which have hitherto been supposed unalterably to separate the various nations of the globe." It makes you wonder what these folks would think of our planes that go about 500 miles an hour, or the internet, which connects people across the globe faster than the blink of an eye. The distance, truly, has been annihilated. Unsurprisingly, the ever-fretful Victorians were deeply worried about the psychological implications of train travel, and it didn't take long for incidents to crop up on board that seemingly proved them right. The Saturday Review wrote in July 1864, "It is the glory of an age of scientific process to have invented a perfectly new and unique description of social torture. The English railway carriage, more specifically the English first-class railway carriage, may be defined as an apparatus of unexampled efficiency for isolating a human being from the companionship and protection of his fellow creatures, and exposing him a helpless prey to murderous outrage." Murderous outrage? Well, yes! We'll get into that a little bit more later, but it was slowly becoming apparent that a phenomenon called railway madness was beginning to crop up. Especially in first class, the doors were often locked for privacy or to prevent passengers from moving between cars, leading to numerous cases of people being trapped in their compartments with, apparently, raving lunatics. Many papers wrote fearfully that these lunatics were madmen escaped from asylums, but more often than not, that was not really the case, and more frequently, it was a case of something that they called train psychosis. While in the lower carriages of the lower classes, there was a great deal of conversation, music playing, games, and general sociability, the first-class cars were notably silent and really awkward, with people reading or staring out the windows, unwilling to converse for propriety's sake. People felt trapped, and once you board your car, you're stuck there until the next stop, and all the while you're being tormented by fears of being trapped inside in the case of fire or derailment, or if one of your fellow travelers develops a touch of railway madness. And the lack of ability to communicate between cars or with the guards meant that you had no way to cry out for help until the next stop, which could be hours from then. This would be improved on in later years when it became customary to have carriage attendants or porters. The more incidents of violence aboard trains happened, the more doctors sought to pathologize why it could be happening. They theorized that it could be a combination of the smoothness of the train's movement, giving the sensation of flying, combined with the distinctly mechanical vibrations the cars had, causing a constant shaking of the body and straining of the muscles, and the dull roar of the train was forced upon the ears all the while. This, they said, aggravated the mind and nervous system, leading to a psychological break that was only cured when the train journey ended or paused. Literally, there were numerous incidents reported of men in particular beginning to rant, rave, and scream as soon as the train took off, pounding on the windows and attempting to attack other passengers, many of them stripping naked. They returned to normal when the train made stops, and then went wild once more when it moved again. The appearance of railway psychosis coincided with a lot of panic by the medical community over sudden, never-before-pondered questions. What happens to the human body when it's subjected to the unprecedented speeds of a train? When it goes through a tunnel, is there enough air for people to breathe? Does the tunnel trap in noxious gases from the locomotive, suffocating and poisoning its passengers? If you read on a train, does it damage your eyes? Does the velocity cause miscarriage in pregnant people? I had a lot to think about while packing for this journey. After all, I had a ticket for a roomette, and I would be traveling with a friend, so there's no space to keep a large suitcase and whatnot. Hilariously, on our trip back to Chicago, the second Amtrak trip we took, there were some people who super duper did not get this memo, and they attempted to bring their full-size suitcases into the roomette with them. There literally is no room, and they attempted to put the suitcases on the top bunk. Where they attempted to sleep, I have no idea. I couldn't see what happened after that because they closed the curtains. Regardless, because of this problem, it makes a lot of sense to follow late Victorian guidance. I have one bag that I stick on the rack downstairs, and a much smaller bag and personal item to keep in the roomette, which was like this little bitty mini suitcase that I have, and then my small backpack. And even that was kind of too much stuff, and I kept having to shuffle it around because it was getting in the way. I also had the traveling circumstances that most Victorian travelers also had. Because I was traveling to visit my family and to a warmer climate at that, I needed to bring a lot less with me than if I were traveling to stay in a hotel, for instance. But I would need at minimum whatever I would require while on the train, and think economically about clothing. Luckily, my good friend Nicole Rudolph has already made an amazing video about the history of travel wardrobes. Definitely check out Nicole's entire video, I've linked it below. I have a real fascination with historical luggage. My favorites are the big trunks that fold out to be a literal wardrobe, like they kind of flip up and then have like a flat surface and all these unique little drawers for everything you would possibly need. It has like a mirror. Some of them even have a clothing rack. It would be great for me, considering that I never use the dressers in hotels because they kind of gross me out. I always keep my clothes in my suitcase. You know those videos that go viral of people like ultra cleaning their hotel rooms, and people are always in the comments like, this is what psychosis looks like. Wrong! I do that. I'm normal. I swear to God, I'm normal. That shit's nasty. You don't know what people who were using that room before you were doing in there. By the time this video is over, everyone here is gonna be so aware of my cool and sexy complexes. This era of train travel had many options for what sort of experience you ended up with. As things developed, you had a choice of a first, second, or third class ticket, which varied widely in price depending on what line you took. Many of the poorest passengers ended up riding in what were essentially freight or boxcars, as if they were luggage. And of course, in many cases, passengers of color were segregated to separate cars. But not always, as white upper middle class riders often wrote of their discomfort being forced to sit next to non-white people on their journeys. This tended to happen much more in like the South or the West because they really couldn't justify the cost in adding an entire segregated area or car. So you're just gonna have to deal with it. Everybody's gotta sit together, get over yourself. It all depended on company policy and location. The good news was getting a ticket was fairly easy because not only did stations sell them, but hotels also sold them, and so did the conductor on board if you were desperate enough or really late. Interestingly, a lot of the early train tickets were made of more permanent materials like wood, metal, or leather, which I'm sure made sense at the time because reusable, but people kept holding onto them to reuse for free, and the railways eventually conceded to start using paper tickets. Stations themselves struggled to adapt to the new world. They often were repurposed buildings that were already there, only with train car storage slapped on. As the number of travelers grew, though, the stations now had the means to expand, and hotels started cropping up dotted around each one, especially in larger locations. Other stations were essentially little shacks, and by no means presumed themselves to be a location that anyone wanted to stay at. More of a utilitarian stop for rural areas. The northeast of the US saw some of the first large and more extravagant stations popping up, which offered delights and services such as smoking rooms, parlors, dressing rooms, attendants, reading rooms, dining rooms, barbers, restrooms, newsstands, shoe shiners, luggage storage, and a telegraph office, along with increasingly beautiful architecture. No longer was train travel a new and frightening anomaly. It was quickly becoming the preferred method of travel, and one that offered comforts and respectability at that. As my Amtrak journey began, I got to have a more immersed experience in Chicago Union Station than I had ever had before. I had only ridden Metra out of here in the past, so basically I had always simply shown up with my bag and gone directly to the train, maybe puttered around the vending machines. There used to be like a boba vending machine, and I don't know if it's still there. Other than that, Union Station is super gorgeous. It was built in the 1920s, designed by architect Daniel Burnham, and today is overrun by confusing construction and the Amish. The previous station was built in the 1880s and looked more like a large house, but was certainly in line with station design back then. Unlike many other US Union stations that were named to signify their alliance with the Union after the Civil War, the one in Chicago was named this way to represent its union of 4 different train lines. Funnily enough, LA Union Station, my destination, isn't all that different. It was built in the 30s as a union of 3 different train lines, replacing the 3 pre-existing stations, the La Grande Station, Central Station, and Salt Lake Station, which were all from about like the 1890 to 1910s. My experience in the legendary LA Union Station is even more limited than Chicago. I've only ever walked inside of it or nearby, but it's an icon of LA history and cinema history at that. Regardless, it's much smaller than Chicago Union with less amenities. Getting picked up here really beats getting picked up from LAX, which makes me want to fucking die every single time. Nevertheless, both stations offer first-class lounges through Amtrak, which I am very pleased about getting access to due to having a private room ticket. I love a lounge. I don't know what it is, I just love the concept of a lounge. It's probably because it recalls the bygone era of these long-lost Victorian and early 20th century stations, which provided a much larger array of rooms to spend your time in, much more chic. It allows you to begin your trip in a more relaxed and comfortable manner. The Metropolitan Lounge in Chicago is much bigger and more modern looking than the LA one. I don't know if it's like been updated more recently or something, but I got the impression that the LA one was like a converted conference room. I didn't get footage of the Chicago one because we went in too close to boarding, but it had ample seating, a few kinds of snacks, sodas, coffee, etc. The LA one is really hard to locate in the station. Like, you really have to go hunting for it, and they do not put up many signs to tell you where you're going. And they only served a few drinks, plus bananas and oranges. Hey, they had clean bathrooms, seat trays, and some interesting Amtrak historical memorabilia to look upon. I had to run downstairs to the market to grab snacks, which actually was a surprisingly nice market, including some to bring on board, and when I got back up, an old guy that we ended up sitting with at lunch the next day pointed to my strawberries cup and said, "Someone's gonna rob you for that," which is so real. Fresh fruit is a highly sought after commodity on the train for some reason. You kind of only get it during the meals at like breakfast, and even then it's like just strawberries. I was reading a bunch of Amtrak forums on Reddit, and there were a few people who said that bringing fruit or produce on board is like barter. Like it's the fucking apocalypse. Boarding trains today is an incredibly organized affair. Sometimes they literally lead you from the lounge to your platform, but we didn't really experience that. They just kind of told us where to go. But back in the Victorian era, depending on where you boarded or needed to get off, you had to have the ability to board and disembark a literally moving train, because in rural areas, they simply were not going to stop for you. They maybe slowed down a little bit at most, so you had to really get good at just jumping onto a moving train or off it. To make matters worse, you had scant chances of even finding a train schedule unless you were in a big city. And if you missed your train, fuck you, because oftentimes there was only one train going each way per day. Not so different from Amtrak today, if you're taking the cross-country lines. If you were on time enough to board properly though, you would likely be checking your baggage by handing it to a porter, who would give you a stamped tag to hold onto, much like any coat check system that we still have. Unfortunately, much like today's airlines, the baggage boys on the trains were simply not good at their jobs, and complaints abounded of lost or damaged baggage. And back then, you really had to try hard to be negligent enough to lose or bust those things, because as we saw before, those trunks were enormous and sturdy for literally this reason. American baggage porters were notorious for being super rough with luggage, and this became an internationally known fact, with writers like Nathaniel Hawthorne describing a baggage porter as, quote, "a former employee of Satan." The earliest train cars were very small, often with no roof, and shuttled people around like a wagon. When roofs were included, they still only sat about 8 to 30 people, and still others attempted to ride on the roof. Obviously, not a great setup. Thus arrived the car setup we know today, which hasn't really changed in the last 200 years. William Chambers wrote in 1854's Things as They Are in America. The cars were of considerable length, with a range of windows alternating with polished mahogany panels along the sides, an ornamental ceiling, and a flooring of painted cloth. Each accommodated 58 passengers, who sat 2 together in armchairs covered in red plush in a row on each side, leaving a passage down the middle. Each car was provided with a stove, which stood in the middle on one side and was heated with billets of wood. These early carriages had very little ventilation, if any, outside of wooden shutters, and the only light in the darkness often was only a candle at each end of the carriage, or at best an oil lamp, which kind of came later. This also wasn't great given the fact that these carriages were entirely made of wood. Fires were super common, obviously, and on longer journeys, the wood or coal stoves that provided heat would run out of fuel, and the train would have to randomly stop so that the train staff could go hop off the train and run off and look for wood, often stealing it from people's houses. So, to make matters worse, stoves like these are not actually very efficient. Sit too close and you're roasting like a rotisserie chicken. Sit too far and you're freezing cold. Still, the carriage windows in the early days had no glass, so you ran the risk of getting a face full of flying cinders from the front of the locomotive, not to mention dust and debris. As Charles Dickens wrote in 1842's American Notes for General Circulation of his experience on the rails, there is a great deal of jolting, a great deal of noise, a great deal of wall, not much window, a locomotive engine, a shriek, and a bell. The cars are like shabby omnibuses, but larger, holding 30, 40, 50 people. The seats, instead of stretching from end to end, are placed crosswise. Each seat holds 2 persons. There is a long row of them on each side of the caravan, a narrow passage up the middle, and a door at both ends. In the center of the carriage there is usually a stove fed with charcoal or anthracite coal, which is for the most part red hot. It is insufferably close, and you see the hot air fluttering between yourself and any other object you may happen to look at, like the ghost of smoke. As train journeys lengthened and they did start incorporating overnight comforts like reclining seats or even the very beginnings of sleeper cars, but alas, many Victorian trains simply did not have onboard bathrooms the way we think of them. Once the train took off, you'd better hope you've been able to use a lavatory at the station, because your next best opportunity was wherever the next station was. Thankfully, modern trains do have normal bathrooms, although they're more like airplane bathrooms than anything else, and over time get a little nasty. At first I was like, really? Trains back then had no bathrooms at all? What would they do in the case of an emergency? Well, this was a little bit of a fraught issue back then too. People struggled to reckon with the natural bodily functions we all deal with, and also the rigid Victorian sense of respectability and propriety. By the 1880s, some toilets were beginning to be introduced on board, separated by ladies and gents, and often by class. But especially in the early days, there were the Hooper toilets, which were literally just a hole in the floor of the train car, and any waste ended up right on the tracks. Sorry, I don't know why I said Hooper toilet. It's a hopper toilet, sometimes a dry hopper toilet. Hopper toilet is what it's called. The train sometimes had signs warning passengers only to use the Hooper while the train was in motion. And of course, the amount of luxury or comfort or even safety you experienced was dependent on a massive range of factors. Your gender, class, race, and citizenship status all informed your experience, with wealthy white women experiencing the highest level of luxury due to needing separate cars to protect both their safety and fragile respectability. The lowest of the low were made to ride in emigrant cars, with hardly any amenities and always placed towards the front of the train near the locomotive because it was more susceptible to flying cinders and debris and was hardest hit by derailment. In the early days, the third-class passengers were sat in benches in converted freight cars, exposed to the elements with no roof, until 1844, when the Railway Regulation Act in the UK required that all passengers, regardless of class, must be covered and protected from the weather. Yay! The late 19th century and early 20th century saw a progressive increase in railway comforts as new cars, such as the Pullman sleeper cars, started entering the fray. More and more trains started incorporating saloon, parlor, sleeper, and dining cars that not only had more respectable comforts, but also more elegant design and decoration to mimic the standards of urban life. Over the years, cars moved smoother and had better airflow and lighting, although these more expensive and modern cars were often reserved for long-haul trips. The Pullman cars also employed a fleet of mostly black male porters. These porters were in charge of setting up the beds and providing various comforts like toiletries and handling luggage, waking up passengers in the morning, shining shoes, and accommodating almost anything people needed. definitely needs to be noted here that the Pullman porters faced a great deal of disrespect just from the inherent system. For one thing, they all took on the name George as part of their job after George Pullman. One has to assume it was probably to make it quote-unquote easier for the white passengers that they were serving to remember a name without having to actually get to know them or remember what their real name is. Just gross all around. The other thing is that the Black Pullman porters were some of the earliest labor leaders. Like, they fought to create a union and they won. They actually demanded better treatment, better pay, better conditions at a time where all the cards were stacked against them, because the experience of being on a train, like everything that made the golden age of train travel what it was because of the hard labor of these Black porters, who certainly didn't have the rights or privileges or access to experience the type of service that they themselves were giving to white passengers. The beds had unique fresh sheets, and people were provided towels and water, and in dining cars they ate off real china and tablecloths. Some trains, the 20th Century Limited especially, even had maids, barbers, manicurists, valets, and secretaries. Of course, these luxuries were reserved for the wealthiest passengers, some of whom even had their own private specialized rail cars. Some ultra-wealthy people still have them today, as I learned on my first trip out to LA. We were delayed boarding because 2 private cars were being attached to the train, a thing that Amtrak is required to allow. It was the talk of the train during that trip, and no one was able to figure out specifically who was in those cars. So, how did my experience go on the cross-country train? Well, this isn't my first time traveling on an overnight train. When I went to Europe last year, I took the Caledonian sleeper train from Edinburgh to London, which I was so excited about. I was supposed to travel with my dear friend Abby Cox, but sadly, due to unforeseen circumstances, she could not join me, so it was just little old me all on my lonesome in my tiny room. Of course, the journey wasn't that long. We left close to midnight after all, so I simply filled out the breakfast card and got ready for bed. The room, I thought, was very well thought out. It had a bunk bed, a small sink, a full-length mirror. The wall had outlets, a spot for your phone, a reading light, and water. The bathroom was a shared one at the end of the carriage. It was fine enough. Unlike some trips on these trains, we weren't able to actually eat in the dining car because we boarded at like 11 p.m. and arrived at like 7 a.m. Hello from the train. We're hauling ass right now. It is scary. I spent most of the night tossing and turning because, for one thing, I have insomnia, so the fact that the train jostles so much, I really felt like I was in the Parawiggler. At around 4 a.m., I resigned to my sleeplessness and general excitement about riding a train, though my face doesn't really look like it, and I watched the sky lighten through dawn as we slowly approached London. We arrived close to 7 a.m., I think we got there a little early, at which point the attendant delivered me breakfast in a paper bag and a tea, and my journey was done. Very short, still loved it. So I was really excited to see how my 2-night journey on Amtrak would differ. This time I wasn't traveling alone. I was with my friend Iggy, one of my former classmates from college, so I had someone to share the experience with in our teeny tiny roomette, which was even smaller than the Caledonian sleeper train. Which, honestly, I think it rocked. Our first car attendant, David, was really nice and helpful. There's multiple in-car bathrooms and a shower and a changing room and a coffee/water station upstairs. As you can see, it is quite snug in here. But I like it. We'll see how well I sleep though. I have issues. Now, given my conditions, I knew that sleeping on the train was going to be really hard, but honestly, on the bottom bunk, it's quite comfortable. The jostling was kind of nice, and the only problem was, on the first night, I got sleep paralysis not once, but twice. Kansas City, Missouri. Last chance of fresh air before we go to bed. What a beautiful view. But we made sure to wake up in time to take full advantage of dining car breakfast and the first fresh air break of the day in La Junta, Colorado. Something was wrong with the HVAC in our car. They said that they couldn't actually fix it due to attaching the fucking private cars, and so they couldn't do all their checks before we left. Anyway, so it was really hot and stuffy in our car until the early morning hours when it cooled off. So getting out for those fresh air breaks was really vital. And on the second trip going back to Chicago, I switched with Iggy and slept in the top bunk. Jesus. Which is so different. While the bottom bunk is fairly comfortable because it's a futon laid over the flattened seats so you get more cushioning, the top bunk is woof. The futon lays right on the hard surface, which folds up during the day. You only get 2 feet or so of vertical space up there, so you can't really sit up, and the only way to get up there is to slither like a snake and then just stay put. Also, the bunk locks in at a slightly downward angle, which, paired with the rocking of the train, constantly makes you feel like you're about to fall off, especially because it's also extremely narrow. I cannot imagine how hard it is to use if you're a larger bodied person. I knew logically there was no way I could fall out due to the net, the one that like locks into the ceiling, but it still really felt like it, and I didn't sleep very deeply. It was more like a dozing. I also woke up the second morning with intense sciatic pain. It went away after I went out to stretch in Kansas City, but goddamn, it was rough. However, still miles better than trying to sleep on an airplane seat, which I have never successfully done. One thing I've been thinking about is I was reading a lot about the Pullman car robe, and which is something that my friend Nicole talked about a little bit. So in the Pullman car trains, there was a thing that became known as the Pullman robe, which was like a thing that you're allowed to wear that was like halfway between being indecent and decent, you know what I mean? So it was like acceptable enough to wear while walking around the train. And I don't know, when you look at pictures of it, it's just a robe. It's just a house coat. So what, I don't know how it's different from, I don't know, maybe I'm just being dumb right now because I'm kind of tired, but I really have this on my mind because I want to go get tea so bad, but I'm already in my gym jams and I'm really comfortable.
To all of our Amtrak guests are adventurous train travelers. Folks, we're coming into the Silver City, La Plata, Missouri. If La Plata is your final destination, please.
It's literally on
grab your seats and in the overhead luggage rack on the southwest seat. This is La Plata, Missouri.
Thank you. As I was saying, I don't want to walk through the dining car while everyone's having their nice dinner and my gym jams looking all scruffy. I know, you know, all things considered, I'm wearing quite normal pajamas, but I'm self-conscious. Amtrak food, I had already been warned, is pretty good in the dining car. At least, really good for food you get while traveling. In the cafe car, which is open to all seat classes, it's mostly just snacks and reheated food. It's not too bad, it's pretty good. But the dining car food, which is all included in private room costs, is actually pretty great, and it feels really nice to get to experience real food while traveling, as opposed to bag of airplane pretzels. You're seated at a table with pretty flowers and a view, and some people love this, some hate it, but they seat you with strangers, other passengers. I personally love it because it gives you a built-in way to meet new people, hear where they come from, and why they're traveling. So much of our world today isolates us, so it's really nice to experience a form of travel that encourages community. And the thing is, most people are pretty happy to be riding the train. I don't think I encountered even one person who was like mad to be there. So everyone is usually really friendly. We were seated with several different older couples, one of whom seemed really intent on talking to one of the employees specifically. The guy came over and the old man sitting with us made a few polite suggestions for how Amtrak can improve service. We chatted with this guy for like 10 minutes. And I only found out afterwards that the guy was the literal president of Amtrak. I'm still not sure why he was on our train. He seemed nice though. I mean, we were really talking with like the passion of train travel and hopes for expanding service, and he seemed really interested and engaged with trying to get these things done, but it's hard because Amtrak is constantly under political attack by politicians, lobbyists for car companies or plane companies. Amtrak has the cards stacked against them. A lot of things that people hate about Amtrak, it's really not their fault. Like, they are genuinely doing their best. One of the biggest problems, of course, is the prohibitive cost. I'm not gonna lie, it was very, very expensive. Of course, you can kind of reframe your thinking. You can think like, oh, well, it's 2 nights on a train. which you can equate to basically 2 nights in a hotel, plus travel costs, plus meals. When you divvy up the cost that way, it's actually very reasonable. But most people don't think of Amtrak as like part of their trip. They're trying to get somewhere. It's just like much harder to think of it as a justifiable cost, and most people couldn't even justify it even if they had the money. Like, who can take that many days off work? It's really slow. So it's just, I understand why most people are not able to take Amtrak. Like, this isn't a video of me being like, no one needs to fly a plane anymore. We should all take the train. That's not realistic in the US right now. We don't have high-speed rail. We don't have the government subsidies and funding for train travel that other countries do, and it sucks. It makes me very sad. Hi. Hi, honey. Mila came to say hi. Of course, in the modern day, every once in a while you hear about wacko incidents on Amtrak or other trains. It's pretty few and far between, and I'll get to the incident we experienced in a bit. But the Victorian era had a ravenous interest in the chaos and crime that you may encounter on board a train car. It practically dominated the news cycle, especially in publications such as the Illustrated London News, which was founded in 1842, just in time for the solid ubiquitousness of train travel in people's lives, and therefore, railway travel being common enough to instigate a large number of scandalous stories to report on. The Illustrated London News relied on the railways not only as its means of distribution, but also its content. From accidents and derailment and collisions to robbery, assault, and even murder. Yes, murder. One of the most famous incidents was the Poinceau murder of 1860. That December, a train from Mulhouse pulled into Paris early in the morning. Passengers left the train, all except one whose compartment remained closed. When a worker opened the door, he saw a man lying between the seats and asked him to get up and leave the train. No response. He pulled the shade away from the window, only to find his hand covered in blood. And upon closer inspection, the man on the floor, later identified as Chief Justice Poinceau, was long dead. He had been murdered by the other passenger in his car, who was nowhere to be found. The case came to dominate Parisian news, stoking immense anxiety and fears that trains may be crawling with assassins. A few years later, yet another compartment murder happened in England, and the House of Commons published a report bemoaning the horrid state of travel. There has been indeed a panic amongst railway passengers. Ladies, unable of course to discriminate at the moment between those whom they should avoid and those who should be their protectors, shun all alike. And gentlemen passengers, as well as railway officers of all classes, constantly refuse to travel singly with a stranger of the weaker sex, under the belief that it is only common prudence to avoid in this manner all risk of being accused, for purposes of extortion, of insult, or assault. The fear of isolation due to car compartments at this time was a largely European feature, because most American cars still had an open concept that allowed some level of public exposure. Many murders or assaults were avoided because other passengers in the car were able to restrain an assailant. The downside to this was that the price of safety in numbers was being forced to endure for the length of your journey all the noises, behavior, and other irritating things that comes with sitting in a crowd. Several incidents saw random men, sometimes already troubled and sometimes afflicted with railway psychosis, suddenly getting up and assaulting other passengers, sometimes provoked, sometimes not, or simply having screaming fits. They would have to be detained by other passengers in the car until the next stop, because the lack of communication with the conductor prevented emergency stops. The anonymous writer in the Saturday Review continues, "We all remember again the story of that horrible journey during which the occupants of a carriage were engaged for the greater part of an hour in a life and death struggle with a raving madman. A story which found a partial parallel not many days ago in a case which occurred near Southampton, the chief difference being that in this instance, the maniac sought to destroy his own life instead of cutting and stabbing his fellow passengers. It is surprising that sensation novelists have never, so far as we recollect, availed themselves of a motif so well suited to the purposes of their art as the horrors of railway imprisonment under circumstances of deadly danger, with the means of protection and rescue close at hand, but hopelessly inaccessible." The Illustrated Police News was especially interested in stories of railway madmen, often publishing comic strips depicting reported incidents. But passengers on board the train were not the only danger. Some of them came from outside the train. Robbery increasingly became a common incident, especially as railroads pushed further and further west across the American continent. This was nothing new. Before the railroads, people already had stagecoach robbery to fear. These thieves typically were after money, which on the trains was often stored in the express car, often in safes. Gold, bullion, cash, even jewelry. The Civil War led to a huge increase in train robbery, cementing it in the popular imagination, and leading to it being the feature of one of the first ever pieces of cinema, the Great Train Robbery. Usually, a train robbery went like this. A gang of men on horses would stop the train, kill or apprehend the crew, and then raid the express car or baggage. These gangs actually grew to be seen as folk heroes by the poor Midwesterners and Westerners who saw train travelers, particularly the rich ones and railway barons, as pretentious social leeches. And, well, they were. The robbers, as well as the post-war hobos who hopped on the train and rode on the roofs in baggage cars, were seen as fighting the system, or thumbing their noses at the railroad companies that exploited so many while giving free passage to their rich and politically powerful friends. Funnily enough, you can experience a train robbery yourself in Fort Worth, Texas at the stockyards if you ride the vintage steam engine. I was there in 2023 visiting my college roommate, and we visited Fort Worth, and I demanded we ride the train, of course. I think the actors instantly picked me out as someone who knew what they were about to do because they chose me to hide the bag of money, but robbery and murder weren't the most common incidents you had to fear on the rails. The biggest concern most riders had was actually just simple accidents. In pursuit of the highest profits possible, train lines often shirked basic safety, including often using bad equipment. This, plus trains moving at enormous speeds, caused many issues. And trains had an incentive to go fast because they often hauled mail or freight. Speed plus unsafe equipment equals accidents, and then fires. While the law struggled to force railway companies to comply with safety standards and treat all passengers humanely, accidents persisted. Trains derailed, collided, exploded, broke down in the middle of nowhere, etc. One incident in 1889 saw a disaster near Armagh, Ireland, when a train loaded with too many carriages was too heavy to get up a hill, so they split the train to carry it up in two parts. But the second half had a brake failure and slid back down the hill, colliding at great speed with an oncoming train, killing 80 people. Many of these incidents were extremely deadly, creating the traumatic experience of forcing passengers to witness and be a part of an enormous high-impact event never before comprehended. These people, whether in real life or in pictures or books, had never seen this level of violence and horror, and were now confronted with the views of their fellow passengers dead or dismembered in the worst cases. And the emerging common print media reported on these incidents in breathless detail, while simultaneously trying to protect the reader from the full reality by censoring the illustrations. As Peter Cinema writes in Representing the Railway, Train Accidents and Trauma in the Illustrated London News, the ILN's demurral, its hesitation to hone in on the minutiae of the accident in engraved images, protects the reader from a confrontation with the reality of a relatively new type of catastrophe, insofar as the illustration of that reality might have a more immediate and forceful effect on the reader than the words which attempt to describe it. Articles titled things like "Alarming and Fatal Accident on the Great Northern Railway" began to pepper the gridded pages of newspapers and illustrated journals, whose illustrators took artistic incentive to catastrophize the already horrible events further by cartoonifying them, heightening the intensity of the scene with more smoke, more onlookers, larger flames, more theatrical brawls between passengers. The Illustrated London News especially encouraged some confusion by including any and all accounts of incidents they could get, whether they were accurate or not, often leading to reporting a much more extreme version of events, while also somehow attempting to dampen certain details to protect the delicacy of its readership. Speaking of railway accidents, we actually did experience one. On our voyage back to Chicago around noon of the last day, the train suddenly halted in the middle of nowhere, Missouri. At first we kind of had no idea what happened, but as we waited longer and longer, staring out the window, watching cows, it got hotter and hotter in the carriage because the power was off. My fellow Americans, the train has currently no power. I still think this is better than flying. At least we have a nice view.
Help, Kaz.
Help!
And help that one sleepy cow out in yonder.
After about an hour and a half or more, we did get rolling again, and the conductor let everyone know that we had struck some object on the rails going 90 miles an hour, and it had torn off parts of the mechanics under the locomotive Titanic style. We ended up having to wait for our railway brothers at BNSF to bring us new parts. Amtrak emergency snack review. Airplane pretzels.
Woo!
Fruit snacks. We've got brownie brittle, a Purell wipe. We were only stuck for, what was it? An hour? Oh, I forgot. We got a Nestle Pure Life water bottle. The whole incident really reminded me of that Buster Keaton stunt with the logs on the railroad. But as easy as it is to look at incidents like this and go, wow, trains really are inconvenient. I could never handle that. Here's the thing. You do handle that on planes. Mechanical delays, traffic delays, miscommunication delays, cancellations, incident emergencies, all of which may mess up your travel by hours or even days. We all put up with it while traveling by plane, and the airline companies will do anything to avoid taking any responsibility for it. For all Amtrak's problems, and there were many, the folks on the crew did their best every step of the way to make things more comfortable. Our car attendants were both amazing and continually checked on us to make sure we were doing okay. The dining car staff went out of their way to accommodate and help me when I started experiencing motion sickness. The cafe car workers provided us free water and snack packs during the accident. I had very positive experiences both ways, even with the problems, with 2 different crews, and any discomfort that I had was honestly negligible considering it's the same or less bad than what I deal with on a plane. Length of journey and cost of tickets aside, it was strange passing by so many dying or dead little rural towns that once built their rail stations in hopes that it would open a new age of prosperity, only for those dreams to be dashed. As Sarah Gordon writes in Passage to Union, with an eye to profit, the railroads calculated their earnings in terms of mass populations rather than local needs, a decision that had a profound effect on the social structure of the nation. They determined to sell rural America once more, not as a place to live this time, but as a place to vacation and recapture the beauties of the countryside and the glories of history. But for those who made their home in rural America, images of the railroad evoked not an engine of prosperity, but a lonesome whistle. When traveling across the country in a train, which I know suffers from political attacks and meager funding, how can I possibly complain that the experience is not as comfortable as I would be sitting at home? Maybe someday we'll get high-speed rail, maybe someday Amtrak will get better funding to upgrade some things. But despite all that, despite my bad sleep and the weird top bunk, despite the delays, despite the restroom situation, despite the HVAC issues, despite the accident, the positives far outweighed the negatives. And almost everyone we talked to on board agreed. We had the chance to meet so many new acquaintances in the dining car. An elderly retired Forest Service ranger and his wife, a couple celebrating their 60th birthday, seeing everything in the US that they wanted to see, an old man riding the train for the first time who apparently has a special interest in if AI can learn to be human, a retired couple with a rail pass riding coach all over the US who are much stronger than I am, a Navajo couple who do tours in Arizona on their way to Chicago for a family member's Navy graduation. It was amazing to get to connect with strangers over a meal, looking at a beautiful landscape. And every single person we talked to agreed. Isn't this much better than being on a plane? Isn't it nice to disconnect and slow down for a while? To take in just how lovely our landscape is and just let yourself be silent? How cool is it to see the world move from the bright and windy plains to snowy mountains to the foggy hills of California? I found myself staring out the window with those Victorian writers on my mind, who fretted that on the train the colors of the trees and flowers and stones blur together, preventing you from truly adoring the splendor of nature, the reality of your passage through time and space. And I thought about how strange it is that I now am having the inverse reaction. Really, how strange it all is. It makes you wonder when the rest of us will catch on. Thank you for learning with me about the history of Victorian train travel and its modern American counterpart. I really hope you decide to Try taking Amtrak next time you need to travel, even if it's a short distance. I found it really exciting and a more fulfilling way to travel, but I understand that not everyone has the time or the money. Still, maybe someday we'll be lucky enough to finally get high-speed rail. Someday. A quick, really somber aside here at the end. Many of you may remember over a year ago, one of my channel charities was me asking you to support the GoFundMe for my amazing friend Katie, who was battling breast cancer. I'm very sorry to say that as of last week, Katie, known online as Thistle, passed away after a very long and difficult fight. She is survived by her husband Spain, who intends to continue her work. I just wanted to mention her as she is already deeply missed by so many, and I'm hoping that by maybe saying this and spreading the word of her name, more people will go to her page and appreciate the beautiful art she made. If you're able, please go donate to a breast cancer charity of your choice or a research group, and please, please, please go get a mammogram. And until next time, wash thy hands, wear thy mask, and be kind to your fellow passengers.